Welcome to the Egg Whisperer Show. I'm so delighted to have one of my dear friends on today, Ann Matthews. Ann, welcome to today's show.
Dr. Amy, this is like a goal. This was on my vision board for 2024.
Well,
now, we were just talking about how I was going to sound not so flaky, and I led with vision board. So there we are.
My vision board includes six-pack abs just like yours, just so you know. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. I want those.
I'm ready.
What we're really going to talk about, aside from six-pack abs, endometriosis, acupuncture, and improving immune function. And I want to share with our listeners a little bit about you. Ann Matthews, FABORM, TCMP, and RAC is the founder of Energy Tree Studios in Toronto and a practitioner of traditional Chinese medicine, an experienced acupuncturist, fitness coach, and the host of the Trying to Be Positive podcast. Ann is known for her vibrant energy and profound expertise in health and healing. She brings a unique, down-to-earth, fun approach to her practice, infusing humor and compassion into her work with clients. She and her husband are also the proud parents of 6 beautiful children. Thank you again, Ann, for joining us today.
I really appreciate it.
How can acupuncture, and that's what we're talking about today, as it relates to endometriosis and the immune system, what immune challenges does endometriosis create? Let's start with that, especially for those who are trying to conceive.
So, because endometriosis is a pro-inflammatory disease where endometrial-like tissue grows outside of the uterus and can create systemic inflammation, chronic pelvic pain, heavy bleeding, and bleeding between periods, a lot of the time, patients really get caught up on the pain aspect. And when we're discussing fertility, I think there's a lot of conversation around lesions and how lesions specifically can impact from a structural standpoint fertility, but less so from an environmental or systemic standpoint of looking at the body as a whole. So the most plausible theory about how endo forms is that the lesions are either laid down before birth or that they arrive there via retrograde menstruation. And while the disease can improve with excision surgery, where the strategy is obviously to remove as many lesions as possible, if any endometrial cells remain, the disease can regrow and the immune system will once again be dysfunctional. So specifically, in response to endometrial cells, immune cells secrete cytokines, which are signaling proteins that help control inflammation in your body. There's different clinics here in Toronto that will offer immune testing where we can see how high these cytokines are. And it's amazing to me because a lot of the time patients will have no symptoms and they'll feel otherwise amazing, but they have unexplained infertility. And so the goal then is it's tricky because you have all of these cytokines, but you don't have a way to measure whether or not they're improving. So they're particularly helpful and they allow your immune system to mount a defense if your body actually requires it. But in the case of endo patients, even these small lesions can result in an increase of cytokines and then subsequent immune dysfunction, which obviously is then problematic for trying to conceive from a standpoint of not only egg quality, but also endometrial receptivity. And then the trouble continues with your hormones because endometriosis lesions can both create estrogen and then grow in response to estrogen. And the standard treatment for endo has been to basically turn off ovulation, thereby producing less estrogen. But for women trying to conceive, you kind of need to ovulate. So you need to either ovulate on your own or even with stimulating ovulation with meds, you need ovulation. And so the subsequent production of estrogen that's essential for conception is problematic for endometriosis.
The cytokines are naturally occurring. There is a connection between elevation of cytokines and endometriosis. unfortunately, a lot of doctors, they don't quote unquote believe that endometriosis affects fertility, and they don't believe in the whole theory of cytokines and natural killer cell activity. I don't think this has to do with faith or belief. I mean, it's just science. And, these things are not easy to test because they're expensive. Not everyone has access to these kinds of tests, but I think the most important things, and this is where you come in, is what is the strategy to reduce immune dysfunction? It's not just women with endometriosis who can have immune dysregulation. It's women who have other issues too, like PCOS, for example. So, how can acupuncture help support immune function in women in general?
So, acupuncture can regulate the balance of local macrophages, and therefore they play a role in reducing inflammation. It was found that manual acupuncture at Susan-Lee, which is also known as the AcuPoint Stomach 36, which is just below the knee. I think it's the one that everybody knows just after the one that's in the hand that everybody gets so excited about, Li4. But stomach 36 actually has been found to modulate the macrophage polarization balance by inhibiting pro-inflammatory M1 macrophages and then simultaneously promoting anti-inflammatory M2 macrophages, which then in turn inhibits the expression of pro-inflammatory cytokines, the jerks, and promotes the expression of anti-inflammatory and tissue repair factors.
Our
And
friends.
all of these are, yeah, our friends, not our foes. And all of this is really important for ensuring that the healthy inflammation and optimal fertility of anyone, but is especially crucial for endometriosis because inflammation, it's involved at every level from seed, egg quality, to soil, uterus and receptivity, to environment, systemic inflammation, and then creating havoc with every organ system. One study that I find particularly interesting was one that was done at Harvard Medical School in 2020. So while the rest of us were all hiding away inside, at Harvard they were studying acupuncture. I couldn't do it, but they were great. They actually successfully used acupuncture to reduce cytokine storms in mice with systemic inflammation. So while my patients were suffering, these mice were getting better. Well,
Yeah.
some of them were. And they determined that the success of the treatment depended on where the needles were placed, which is always very interesting because there's a lot of debate around whether or not it's actually just inserting a point or a needle anywhere, or whether it does need to be more specific to an acupoint. It also depended on the length at which they were in there. So this study, it was originally inspired by a 2014 paper, which showed that acupuncture in mice could actually alleviate systemic inflammation by stimulating the vagal adrenal axis, a signaling pathway in which the vagus nerve carries the signal to the adrenal glands to trigger the glands to release dopamine. And this is especially interesting for all of the nerds because the researchers found that the adrenal axis could be activated through the hind limb acupuncture, which, when we're looking at what points are typically chosen for fertility, most of the time there's, I think, an excess of focus on the abdomen and not sufficient focus on points which have been found to actually reduce cytokines, specifically stomach 36. And when they actually used the abdominal acupoints on the mice, those mice actually died, not from the insertion of the needle, which when I think about how long an acu needle is and how tiny the mice are, I'm like, well, obviously they died. You perforated their organs.
And that's the thing. I'm just thinking about these little mice and then
I
like
know. And their cytokine storm. So
acupuncture
sad.
needles and doing a study. I mean, I
How
kind
are
of
they
want to see
staying
it on
still?
the road. I
Did they
know.
get a little
And
eye pillow?
no, some
Like,
red light.
that's
Poor
right.
mice.
I know.
And there are other ways to support endometriosis too. It's not just acupuncture. What are some other ways?
So I really focus on diet. Ultimately, there's not a specific endo diet. And I get really frustrated when I see articles and books and programs being sold as like the endo cure. Because some patients will respond more favorably to increasing foods that help detoxify estrogen, like cruciferous vegetables, whereas other patients, especially those with more temperamental digestion or like IBS, will actually worsen. So some patients similarly will do well with a Mediterranean diet, and then other patients will respond really poorly to the legumes and lentils that are the mainstay of that protein. And then it's interesting because I think beef gets a really bad rap with endo just generally, but I think like anything else, it really depends on the kind of beef. Because if you're having grass fed, organic, non antibiotic fed beef, then they typically will have higher levels of CLA, conjugated linoleic acid, and thus would be anti inflammatory as opposed to pro inflammatory. But I do think a lot of the time, endo patients, because they have the digestive disturbance, they end up being undernourished with a lot of blood sugar dysregulation. And unfortunately, food intolerance ended up being more exacerbated, and they end up having worsening of pain and then progression of the disease. So I really focus on tailoring the diet to the specific patient in question. So I'll have them write out a food journal, and you don't need to do this necessarily with a practitioner right away. This is something that you can do on your own, where you're just more cognizant of what you're consuming. So you want to focus on writing down what you're eating, when you're eating, and the quantity at which you're eating. Because a lot of people think that they are having too many calories, and most of the case that I've been watching recently, it's actually under consuming calories. I use this cool little app that I think is actually available in the States called LifeSum. And I love it because it gives a breakdown of carbs, proteins, fats. This is not sponsored in any way, but it also is a very encouraging app. It will give me encouragement like, hey, you're drinking water today. Well done, not just a coffee. I need that in order for me to use you.
Yeah.
I won't use you if you're mean to me, fitness pal. Um so again, we really focus on blood sugar regulation, high protein, healthy fats, and improved nutrient intake with a focus on cold water fatty fish, organ meats, which I think are disgusting in their raw form, but I will consume as a freeze-dried version in a pill.
Okay, I gotta tell you, that sounds disgusting too.
It's not that bad. It's I have a little jar that's filled with these freeze dried. It doesn't smell. And at stoplights, I will have a spleen or a kidney. You've never felt more productive in your life than when you're consuming organs en masse in the car. Uh,
For people listening, why? Like, what is it in those pills that's so much better than anything else that you can take?
It's just really available sources of nutrition like vitamin A and iron that are otherwise harder to get when you're consuming it in a more synthetic form. If you're really icked by them, which I do understand, you can also just focus on like eggs and not huge amounts of fruit, but fruit because fiber is important, and a lot of vegetables. It's very important to support the gut microbiome and avoid anti-inflammatory foods because it's to me it's always interesting when new studies pop up around something that seems very obvious. And recently there's been a new study that has popped up on how you can identify endometriosis by using bacteria markers in the gut. And when you're understanding how most inflammation is stemming from the gut, that to me seems like an obvious
It's a
hypothesis.
no-brainer.
However, it's a
No
no
brainer.
brainer.
Yeah, if you eat healthier and you're exercising, patients with endo, they have less symptoms.
That's
We know that
exactly it.
to be true. So it's definitely a no-brainer. Are there certain exercises that you support your patients with if they have endo compared to, let's say, is there a difference in the exercise routine as a fitness coach that you recommend?
So it's tricky because I have had patients and I've had followers reach out to me, and they will be just in so much discomfort from their endo pain that when you recommend exercise, they feel like it's just one more thing that they're failing at. So I like to encourage people to start with something really easy, like a walk, because although there isn't anything specific in terms of looking at how you can exercise for endo, Typically, you'll see a lot of Pilates yoga suggestions, which I think ultimately is just because practitioners thus far haven't really looked at the immune system as a really powerful driver of the disease. So I like to take a bit more of an approach to modulate the immune system with exercise. So, in May of this year, the Journal of Sport and Health Science actually published a 20-year systemic review on the anti inflammatory effects of exercise on autoimmune disease. And while endometriosis hasn't been classified as an autoimmune disease, it shares a lot of the characteristics and is clearly based with autoimmune dysfunction. So it was concluded in this meta analysis that from an anti inflammatory perspective, exercising regularly and combining multiple exercise modes, so aerobic and resistance, made a positive effect in terms of inflammation systemically in the body of these patients. Now, they were looking at patients with RA, lupus, MS, and not endometriosis specifically, but I have found in my practice when I've incorporated, 20 to 30 minutes of weight routine along with encouraging patients to get in between 30 and 40 minutes of cardio 4 to 5 times a week. And that can just be a vigorous walk. They feel better from an emotional standpoint as well as a physical standpoint. It helps with sleep, it helps with their digestion, it helps with their self esteem. And because a lot of the time endometriosis is coupled with mental health disorders, it also helps with anxiety and depression. So ultimately, exercise is a win, but only on the days that you have the energy for it. Because if you're feeling uncomfortable, low energy, and then you're pushing yourself to now fit in one more thing, and you're undergoing a fertility journey, it's take that one off the plate and maybe schedule it for a day where you have a bit more time and a bit more zip.
Yeah. Well, I love the time and zip, but the thing is, everyone has an excuse for not having time or zip. So there's simple things that people can do, right? Grab some
True,
5 pound
true.
dumbbells. You're waiting for your microwave to finish heating up whatever it is. That's 1 minute right there. Do some squats with some curls. Touch your toes. Like I wait in between patients. My staff thinks I'm insane. They already know I'm insane. I'm doing lunges down the hall and back,
Dr.
literally.
Amy, where's our video of that? This is
I
what I want
know.
on
I have
YouTube.
my 5 and 10s. I have my yoga mat. I mean, I'm not as ripped as you, but I am going to try and get there. Like I need the abs. The abs are not there just because getting lying down on my yoga mat and doing my sit-ups isn't as easy. I know I can do it probably in other ways, but I'm looking over here just because that's where my I call it my exercise studio is really just a corner of my office. And you can't really see it when patients are sitting in front of me. They have no idea it's here.
That's all you
So
need.
it's so important. You don't need anything else. I mean, literally, just like touch your. Do you know how many people can't touch their toes? It's insane.
Dr. Amy, I cannot touch my toes.
You can. You can
I
touch your toes.
cannot.
No, you can touch your toes, and you can
And
touch your
I
toes.
hired someone to stretch me because I'm that prima donna. I was like, I'm not going to yoga.
You're not
So
that
now
bendy. You
and
look
they're
bendy.
across the street from me. I'm staring at Stretch Lab right now. They call
Yeah.
me incessantly. You have this many sessions. Use them. I'm like, no,
Everyone needs to be
no.
bendier as they're going to pregnancy. Everyone needs to be able to, not be out of breath pushing a stroller, right, once you deliver. So I appreciate that you support your patients with fitness too, because so many of my acupuncturists tell their patients that they can't get their heart rate up. They can't exercise. And I'm just like, that is like the worst thing that you can tell patients. So I just love that you're coming on here as an acupuncturist expert laying things down right for us so people can get the truth from an expert. So I want to hear success stories. Like everyone wants to hear a good success story where like you had a patient that did all this stuff and then they had a positive outcome. Tell us some.
Yeah, I have quite a few. My favorite is my patient Lindsay, who had a very severe endodiagnosis, stage 4. She had large endometriomas on her ovaries. It was recommended that she undergo IVF in order to help facilitate pregnancy. And I was very supportive of that because she had been trying for over 2 years at that point. And although there's always the risk of stims increasing the size of those endometriomas, at that point, there really wasn't another option because removing them where they were located would have potentially caused more scar tissue because it was on both ovaries. So we underwent, 3 months prior to her retrieval of lifestyle changes, acupuncture, some tailored supplementation, and she very bravely retrieved 2 eggs. And it was interesting because she was under the care of this very forward thinking REI named Tom Hannum. He's great. He doesn't practice as much now. Now he mostly manages his clinic. But most REIs, at least in Toronto, would have just canceled it. With 2 dominant follicles, there's no way that they would have even bothered. But Tom went for it and retrieved both because he's of the opinion that although endo patients, especially in her position, had less follicles, they don't necessarily have worse quality. So he retrieved them, and both of those eggs actually they fertilized, they made it to day 3, they were transferred, day 3 embryos, and have turned into her twin boys.
Oh,
So, and although when she first came to me, I was joking around that she was going to end up with twins,
yeah.
and she now initially thought it was a curse, but because I think she wanted daughters.
Is there any other information you want to share about acupuncture supporting better outcomes for patients with endometriosis?
I've stated a lot of studies, and I've made myself out to be much more boring than I really am, but I will say the 2023 systemic review and meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials on the clinical efficacy of acupuncture on diminished ovarian reserve found that acupuncture produced a significant decrease of follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and a significant increase of AMH, which is very important because in my endometriosis patients, I do note that FSH is typically on the higher side and AMH is typically on the lower side. So when going into a cycle, for example, of IVF, being able to give your patient the best outcome by starting out with the best levels, lower FSH and higher AMH, you're supporting the whole system. So we can work together as a team. And then obviously, post retrieval, being able to provide support in prepping the body to once again reduce inflammation and get it ready for a transfer, that's to me super exciting. So acupuncture, I think it's really important that we position ourselves as really good and important supports to the full fertility journey as opposed to choosing one over the other. Because a lot of the time, I have a lot of patients who will come in and very lovingly declare, "You're the only one I'm going to see," which is very nice. But A, I don't like that much pressure. And B, it's always best to work as part of a multidisciplinary team. So I'm in Oakville, but McMaster is very close to us in Hamilton. They have an amazing clinic called Sugo where they're doing ultrasound to find endometriosis, which is amazing because prior to this, surgery has been the way in which one has been diagnosed. Knowing you have endometriosis before you go into any fertility journey, it really informs it. And I love at the beginning of the interview where you said that that it matters because it really does. And a lot of the time, where I think we should find a divide is between practitioners who think that endometriosis doesn't matter in fertility outcomes. They're wrong. And practitioners who think that it does. We're right. And
Right.
really facilitating that as part of a team.
Yeah. Well, and the only thing I wish is that you lived here. I wish you were in California. I wish my patients could see you. I mean, what the heck?
Dr. Amy, I wish that too, honestly. It's terrible here. Help me.
Oh, I know. But seriously though, where can people find you to work with you? Like, can they do it virtually?
I'm most active on my Instagram, which is Energy Tree Ann, where I post a lot of these studies if you were finding them titillating, and I break them down as to what they actually mean. And the best way for you to start in terms of working with me would be to pay attention to those studies, print them out, and use them in your own advocacy for your own care. That's really important and powerful. I am going to be offering more virtual, if you will, by way of providing more information in packages that you can then use to improve your lifestyle to favor fertility. But in the interim, unfortunately, my list for patients right now is closed. But hopefully, enough people will be pregnant soon enough, and then I will reopen the list.
Well, Anne, thank you for sharing all your wisdom. It's always a blast talking to you. You're such a light for all your patients and for me. You know, anytime I see your posts, I'm always jealous of your abs. I know I've said that like 20 times, but it does make me want to be as fit as possible. And I'm sure that you just set such a great example for your patients too, and they probably comment on that as well.
Dr. Amy, you're extremely kind. I normally actually am just wandering around this clinic shirtless. So they are forced to comment on it. Like, look at me. No.
I mean, if I had abs like that, I'd probably walk around shirtless too, honestly. And
I
flatter my
honestly do.
yeah.
But then this would be a different type of podcast.
Definitely. Well, Anne, thank you so much for your time today. You're the best. I really appreciate you and hope you come back on very soon.
Thank you so much. I'd be delighted.